You are today. I'm Akhtas Aslam, and we will be starting off our first session for the Research Methodology course 2026. Over the last few years, we have been working to synchronize our sessions with the Retire Researcher Development Framework, considering that the RDF was reconfigured in 2025. At present, the 24 webinars that we will be presenting can best be stated as follows. CLT's Research Methodology course provides a strong coverage of the RDF domains of researcher values and behaviors, research methods and digital literacy, ethical and responsible research, scholarly communication and publication, and collaborative research culture. It offers only limited coverage of funding and finance, formal project management, supervision and people management, coaching and mentoring, and research translation or commercialization. So today, I would like to welcome you all. I believe that there are a lot of people from Pakistan, but also from across the world. And I would like to welcome you all to this first session on the theories of research, ontology, epistemology, and axiology. Okay. I'm Akhtas, as I've introduced myself earlier. I am the chair of the CLT Advisory Committee, and I'm a CLT fellow and lead the course redesign workshop. The main purpose of this series is largely a collaboration amongst scholars. It is the peer sharing of knowledge, and we would love for this to we do make an intentional effort to honor diversity and the service components of the FCCU values as part of these workshops. So for these webinar series, there will be 23 following webinars. We will include a foundational overview of research paradigms, and this particular presentation, will produce, this particular presentation will include a foundational overview of research paradigms and focus on the critical pillars of ontology, epistemology, and axiology. It will set strong foundations for academic exploration of research and grounds the upcoming theoretical discussion in a context that values diverse knowledge and perspectives. So I would like to introduce our resource person for today, Dr. Lynette Pretorius. I hope I have pronounced that correctly.
You did, actually.
Thank you. She is a senior lecturer at the School of Learning and Teaching at the Monash University, an award-winning educator and researcher known for reimagining higher education through innovative, inclusive, and transformative teaching practices. She has drawn on interdisciplinary expertise to integrate diverse ideas, lived experiences, and pedagogical approaches in the creation of meaningful learning environments. Dr. Pretorius has extensive teaching experience across undergrad, postgraduate, and graduate research programs, including the supervision of PhD candidates. Her research focuses on fostering compassionate, equitable, and creative educational environments, with particular interests in doctoral education, AI literacy, research literacy, academic identity, and student well-being. She has authored numerous peer-reviewed publications, including 2 academic books that examine the lived experience of graduated research students. As a Higher Education Academy Senior Fellow, she has received international recognition for her leadership in teaching and learning. Her work is particularly noted for designing transformative educational experiences that prioritize the well-being, social justice, and student development. Dr. Pretorius is also widely known for her public scholarship through the Scholars Way blog and the University Study Made Easy YouTube channel. I am so excited that she is leading the first session for this webinar series, and we would like to welcome you today, Dr. Lynette, officially.
Thank you.
Thank you. I believe it is now over to her to take you over the session. I believe she already has the host sharing rights.
Yes,
So
I do.
good to go. Okay. Thank you. If participants who have questions can share them in the chat box when it opens, and they will be consolidated by the CLT team and shared at the end of the session.
Great. So thank you for that nice introduction. I'm Lynette from Australia, so it is very nearly the end of the workday for me. And today I'm going to talk to you about my research paradigms masterclass, specifically about ontology, epistemology, and axiology, what they are and how they join together to form different research paradigms. I will also highlight to you there is no way that I can possibly talk about every research paradigm that exists. So I'm going to talk about the most common ones, and then there are many others that I would encourage you to explore to find the one that suits your particular way of understanding the world. As I come from Australia, it is common practice to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting. So I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Bunurong people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and developing, and also any traditional owners from places around the world that may be joining us today. So in its most basic form, ontology talks about what reality is, and epistemology talks about how you can know that reality. When you combine those together, along with your axiology or what you value, you develop your research paradigm. And as I said before, there are many different ones. Some that you may have heard of before is positivism or constructivism or pragmatism. So ontology, as I said before, talks about what reality is. And ontology sits on a spectrum. On the one end, you have what is called a realist ontology. This is where there is an objective central core truth that can be found. Reality can also be on the other side of the spectrum, which is subjective, and this is called a relativist ontology. And this is where there are different realities for different people. So in other words, when you are talking about your ontology in your research, you are talking about whether you think there is a single objective reality or truth out there that you can find if you measure it with the right tools, or whether you think that reality really is more a construct that is developed in people's minds through their experiences and perceptions. Epistemology then focuses on how you can then examine that reality. So in general, there are three basic epistemologies. The first one is that you can measure that reality if you can use the right tools. The second one is that it can only be partially known because it's created in the minds of people. So you can only really know what they tell you. Or three, that really you can't know it at all. It is constantly changing. And so it is really impossible to comprehend because people keep changing their understanding of reality. Axiology talks about what is valued in research. So this requires you to actually think about you as the researcher, what you value, why you are interested in researching whatever it is you are researching, and how that will influence the way that you interpret your findings. So in general, this is also on a spectrum from value-free to value-laden. So on the value-free side, you talk about whether the researcher should be an objective observer who is outside of the research and just looking at whatever is happening and reporting it. On the other side of the spectrum is the value-laden side, where you acknowledge that research is always influenced by values. And so you have to consider whether how your values will be part of your project, whether you have to put in place some steps to account for your subjectivity, or whether you really, on the very other end of the spectrum, really value that subjectivity as something that is uniquely part of this project. Now, when you combine these together, then you get your research paradigm. So research paradigms have been around for many years, and until probably really the 1970s, they were overwhelmingly focused on positivistic or scientific ways of seeing things. So this comes all the way from the scientific revolution many years ago, where there was a great enlightenment, and so therefore we must seek specific ways of measuring objective things to get an answer. And so this is where positivism comes from. It is well known for all those, famous philosophers who are looking for an objective reality or truth. So they are realists. And therefore, if they measure it with the right tools, they have an objective epistemology, and they can then get the core truth or thing that they're interested in discovering. Original positivism believed that research should be value-free, and therefore the researchers should be completely removed from the research as much as is possible in terms of interpretation and so on. So this is something that you still today see in particularly in quantitative research. Now, positivism has adapted over time, in particular in relation to the epistemology part. So it is now called post-positivism, and this is what you see most often in quantitative research, especially scientific experimental research, where they are still realists. They still believe there is an objective reality, like there is a cure for a disease, for example. However, they also understand that really we can't necessarily fully understand that. It is something that's a little bit hidden. And so they have still that objective way of looking at things, but they do understand that research and knowledge changes over time because knowledge is inevitably theory-laden. And therefore, when you do your experiments and you get your findings, you may end up changing original theories as new knowledge becomes available. So they see knowledge as critical and fallible. They also believe that research should be value-free, but they are also aware that this is really not possible because researchers there's always something that influences them to do the research. And additionally, research is always political and things like that. And so what they do is they try and put in place strategies to remove as much as possible the bias of the researcher. So constructivism is a fairly common paradigm, particularly in the social sciences. Constructivism believes that reality is different for different people. So reality is subjective. There can be three people who see the same event, but they understand it differently because they are interpreting it through their own experiences. So it's created in their minds, and they see something in one way, which the person next to them sees in a different way. Therefore, they believe that knowledge is socially constructed and subjective. So the researcher and the participants, when they're doing research, co-construct meaning together through their interactions and their experiences. Constructivists are explicitly value-laden. Not only do they think that research should include the researcher values, but they in fact believe that the subjectivity of the researcher is really something that should be embraced and should be part of the process, because someone who is very knowledgeable about something can bring better insights to the research than someone that is just completely objective and outside of the project. So for them, they encourage reflexivity so as to understand your own experiences and why you see the world you do, but then to use those experiences to help you understand the data. Interpretivism is something that is quite closely related to constructivism, but is actually different. So they also believe that reality is subjective and created in the minds of people, and they're particularly interested in the interpretations people make in their heads when they see something or do something. That's what they're really interested in. So they have an epistemology where they should not really co-construct meaning with their participants, rather they should elevate the voice of their participants and specifically look at the meanings those individual participants make about particular things, because that's what they're really interested in. Like constructivism, they are also value-laden, and that those values are central to the interpretation, but that the researcher always must put the participant voice first, not the researcher voice. Now, it is important to note that these are not the same thing. You can see quite often in research papers that something is an interpretivist study. This is not the same thing as interpretivism as a paradigm. So as I said on the slide here, interpretivist research is basically all qualitative research because it is you interpreting what people are saying. But interpretivism is why you do your research in a specific way. And you can see back from my table from before, it's because you're interested in understanding those individual meaning making that people are doing in their daily activities. The other thing that's important to understand is that constructivism and interpretivism are not the same. They are frequently used interchangeably in literature, especially slightly older literature, because it's only fairly recently that they have been considered distinct paradigms. So you can often see researchers saying, we use the constructivist/interpretivist paradigm. And that is because only recently these became distinct. And those things usually are actually constructivism papers. So it's important to note that they are not the same. Constructivism and interpretivism do have the same ontology, that is, multiple realities created in people's minds, but they do have a different epistemic view of the world. And this is specifically related in what the researcher's role is in understanding those realities. So constructivism is all about the co-creation of knowledge and construction of meaning together, so that knowledge is actually actively co-constructed during the research process. Whereas interpretivism is about understanding and explaining people's reality, but not influencing how they understand those realities. So the researcher is an interpreter, not a co-constructor. Then you get pragmatism. Pragmatism basically says, well, things keep changing, so you just do whatever suits the process best. So they believe that reality is ever changing, so they've got a dynamic ontology. So reality keeps changing because it's shaped by our daily and experiences and practical outcomes of things. And so because things are always changing, reality is always changing. Because of this, there is no correct way to do something. They believe that the knowledge that they get from examining reality should be judged by how useful it is, because they're interested in outcomes, practical outcomes for studies. And so their values drive the whole process because it shapes the goals from the beginning, because they usually have a problem that they want to solve with a practical outcome that has a real-world impact. Pragmatism is often associated with mixed methods research. It enables the combination of qualitative and quantitative methods quite easily. Critical realism is an interesting paradigm that is quite new in terms of research. It tries to find a balance between the positive scientific way of seeing things and the constructive subjective way of seeing things. So they have what is called a stratified realist view of the world. They believe that there is an objective reality that exists, just like those scientists we were talking about before, right? There is a cure for a disease. There is an objective reality that is out there. However, they believe that this reality is hidden underneath layers of meaning, so that sometimes you can only see the sum of the layers. You can't actually find that core truth. And so what they try and do is have an explanatory epistemology. So they're trying to explain the different layers. And in critical realism, there are 3 layers. The first one relates to what you can see. So like people doing specific things or saying specific things in the interview. Then there is the things that are happening around them that causes them to do those things. And then there is the underlying mechanisms. And critical realists are really interested in those underlying mechanisms to understand what is driving the things that you can see. And they also believe research is value laden, but that researchers do need to be really reflexive of their biases, because you have to be able to understand those different layers. And if you're looking at it through a very specific lens, you may miss some of those underlying mechanisms. So as I am showing you this is an example of a paper that I wrote a paragraph out of it. So this is generally how people write about it in their work. Now, I've deleted the first sentence out of here so that you can think about what is this paradigm that you may be seeing here. This is constructivism, right? So some key things that identify that for you, firstly, is the Lincoln and Guba reference, because they are very famous in constructivism. But more specifically, they talk about socially constructed understandings, which you'll remember before is very important for them, and co-created with participants, right? And the other thing they talk about is that reality is subjective. So that is how people write about it in their research. Now, in olden times, paradigms weren't really part of the writing process, but this is continuously now being expected in research, especially in qualitative space, but it is also increasingly expected in purely quantitative, scientific, even, lab-based research. Increasingly, these things are now expected to be mentioned. So it's important to talk about them and to start thinking about your paradigm really early, because your paradigm actually shapes your whole research process, right? All the way from what it is you're researching up to how you interpret the results or findings that you got. In addition, different paradigms lend themselves to different aspects, like study design. For example, different research approaches do not suit certain methods or certain paradigms. So something like constructivism or interpretivism would usually not go very well with a purely quantitative survey or a psychometric scale, for example. So it's important to understand these things so that you can try and avoid any contradictions in your work and make sure that everything is cohesive and aligned together. Additionally, it influences how you interpret your research, because I mentioned before that the different paradigms see the role of the researcher differently. So when you are interpreting your findings, there's a difference between being that objective observer versus co-constructing meaning with participants. And so the findings are presented in quite different ways. Additionally, axiology is particularly important for which topic you're interested in, and ethics, because your values and the way that see the world influences the way you see the relationship between you and the participants, why your research is important, all those sorts of things. So it has a real impact on the ethics of the research process as well. Oops, wrong way. So for example, let's talk about the research question. If you are a positivist or a post-positivist, likely the research questions you're going to ask are framed through scientific hypotheses, right? Measurable variables, seeking to establish a cause and effect outcome for something. If you are a constructivist or interpretivist, and usually a critical realist, you are much more likely to want to understand how people understand things and experiences, and then to try and understand the complexity of people's understandings, right? So because of that, your research questions are much more fluid, much more meaning focused, certainly much more qualitative. Pragmatism can go either way, depends on what you are interested in, but mostly is focused on solving a problem, right? So usually the questions are like, what is the problem? How does this thing solve the problem? How does this other thing solve the problem? And therefore, what can others learn from the process? Critical realists fall also sometimes into this flexible category because critical realist does allow for mixed methods research more than the other two. So in terms of the methods then, positivists or post-positivists are much more likely to use a scientific method or quasi-experimental methods in their studies because they're trying to find a concrete answer or solution, right? So having a clear methodology that accounts for all the extraneous variables and can clearly prove cause and effect, for example, is what they're trying to do. Therefore, they are much more likely to follow the scientific method in their process, or if it's a more educational study, for example, it's usually a quasi-experimental study because in those studies, sometimes it is unethical to have the control group in the studies. Constructivists and interpretivists would usually use qualitative approaches. So this can be a survey if it's a qualitative survey, but not something like a psychometric scale that puts people into boxes. They're not really interested in those sorts of works because they're really interested in trying to deeply dive into people's lived experiences. And to be able to do that, you need to use more qualitative things like interviews or focus groups or art-based methods, things like that. Pragmatists and critical realists tend to use mixed methods. However, pragmatists go with whatever is best to answer the question, because remember, they're looking for practical outcomes. So they'll go with whatever suits them best. Critical realist is really interested in those underlying mechanisms I mentioned before. So they will use different methods to be able to go from the different three layers that they think of to get to those underlying mechanisms. So I have previously written a paper that is where this table is coming from. That talks about the paradigms and then shows you the research designs and common methods that go with them, right? So you can see here, positivists are about the experimental or quasi-experimental designs. They also usually do survey research. And the other one that is quite commonly associated with it is grounded theory, because grounded theory's purpose is to develop a theory as an outcome. And so they are trying to explain something by getting a core framework out there. So they tend to use quantitative questionnaires, psychometric scales, scientific experiments, those sorts of things to get their data. And then to analyze their data, they are likely to use things like statistics, so both descriptive and inferential statistics, to show significant differences before and after. Constructivists tend to use other types of research. So you will see survey research and grounded theory is still there, but it's done in a slightly different way. The experimental things are gone now because they are interested in understanding meaning, right? So something like autoethnography or case study or narrative inquiry is quite popular in this field because they're trying to understand individual people's understanding of things. Document and policy analysis is also quite common because it helps to understand meaning in a particular context. Like when a policy talks about things in a certain way, it makes people construct meaning in a certain way. And so their approaches are quite qualitative. They do the interviews, focus groups, diaries, arts-based methods, observations, those sorts of things. If they're going to do survey research, the surveys are likely to be in-depth qualitative surveys, or that the survey will be a starting point to identify people for further study using these other methods. When they do analysis of their data, they tend to focus on meaning making. So this includes thematic analysis, content analysis, and discourse analysis as the most common ones. But other ones, for example, would be visual analysis if the participants made artworks as part of the process or something like that. You'll see that interpretivism is very similar to the constructivism one that I just showed you before. The thing that is different here is that phenomenology has now appeared. Phenomenology is the most commonly associated thing with interpretivism, and they are very interested in finding the essence of meaning that people are making. And so that's why phenomenology works really well. And the other thing that's different is the analysis methods, because if they're going to use phenomenology, there are very specific phenomenological ways of doing things. And so phenomenological analysis has been added. Pragmatism uses anything that's out there because it's whatever works best. And therefore they use a combination of quantitative and qualitative. Sometimes they do quantitative first and then qualitative. Sometimes it's the other way around. It is whatever works best to answer the question. And critical realism is whatever works best to be able to explore the different layers of meaning. And so usually the observable things are things that you can get with surveys and interviews. But then the deeper meaning things require you to draw from several different data sources to be able to find those underlying mechanisms. So when you write about your paradigm in your research, it's also important to note that you don't want it to be just a textbook explanation. Like if you're going to use interpretivism and then I want to use interpretivism, I shouldn't be able to copy your paragraph into my study, right? Because it is something that is personal. So here I've shown you an example of a paragraph that uses constructivism, but that justifies the reasoning from the researcher's perspective. So ontology is shown in green. So this is the relativist ontology. Talking about this particular study within this paper, it represents this thing, right? Epistemology is purple, so you'll see that's social co-construction that we were talking about before, and how all the different participants in this study, which in this case was the researcher, the participant, and ChatGPT, all together came up with an understanding of the knowledge that they found in this study. And then the orangey bit talks about the values. In this case, the values associated with how the AI is being positioned in the study. There's also a second paragraph that talks about the ethical values of generative AI that the researchers espouse as they are using it. So this is how you talk about it. It's not just, Lynette's paper says ontology is this, but is more importantly, for my study, I see it this way, and therefore I did the following things. So when we go now to the question time, we'll notice there's some questions that are starting to appear there. I would suggest you to start thinking about these as a way to prompt you to ask your questions. So when you are doing your study, have you thought about which paradigm you're going to use? If you have you identified one specifically, or are you confused by the many, many complex pieces of text that are out there related to what a paradigm is? Because realistically, most of the time you have to read really complex philosophy texts to be able to understand ontology and epistemology and these sorts of things. So what is it that still you're finding difficult or to explain or understand? What is it that you still need to know before you can write a similar paragraph to the one I had before? What do you still need to know for you to be able to justify how you see the world, how you understand the world can be examined, and what you value. It's important to realize that the paradigm is about you, how you see the world. The framework, which is a whole different session, the theoretical or conceptual framework you use is about how the data will be understood and the concepts are and what they mean. Here you are talking about yourself and how you understand. And then once you've identified this paradigm, have you actually thought about how the paradigm influences the methods that you are going to use? Are there some problems with the method you thought you were going to use and the paradigm that you are intending to use? Because do they fit together or do they not fit together? How can you address that concern? Or maybe you need to completely change to a different method. So before I stop the sharing for questions, I will highlight to you, in addition to this session being recorded, everything that I just said to you is on my YouTube channel in the Research Paradigms playlist. There's a whole series of videos about that. Okay, so I'm going to stop the screen sharing now and encourage you to put your questions into the chat, which I see has been opened up there. And I believe we have a question there from Muhammad, who wants to know, how do we designate ontology and epistemology in our own study? It's usually not in the literature review. It is presented often at the start of the methodology. So because it shapes everything in terms of the design of your research, it fits best in your methodology right at the start to say, this is how I see the world. And then therefore, this is how I've set it out. And in something like a PhD thesis, the paradigm discussion is often multiple pages long. Consider you need at least probably 2 paragraphs each for ontology, epistemology, and axiology. In terms of axiology, it can also be a reason why you are doing your study, right? It is the motivation for your work. So sometimes you will already have talked about some of that right at the introduction when you are setting out the motivation or rationale for your research, and then you can link those together. I see what you mean. In terms of the literature review, yes, it can be something that you can discuss. The reason you would do that is if you are trying to make the argument that everyone has always only, asked things in certain ways, but I see the world in a different way, and so I am approaching it with a different paradigm. That would be the reason for discussing it in the literature review, because remember that the literature review's purpose is to identify the gap that your research is going to fill. So if you're going to compare paradigms, or you're going to compare methodologies, or going to compare other ideas out there, then that means that has to be done for a reason, usually to say, my way of doing the study is therefore best because it's going to fix that problem.
Dr. Lynette,
Yes.
we also have another question from Dr. Sharif from the American University of Kuwait. He's asking, as someone who belongs to the social science background, this certainly aligns with his approach, but he's of the opinion, how would these approaches work in humanities? Would the sciences have some flexibility?
I think so. So the physical sciences don't really have flexibility. They kind of have to use either post-positivism or pragmatism. Maybe they can get away with critical realism, but that's probably about it. The social sciences and humanities are more flexible because they are interested in people's experiences. And so therefore it can be different things for different people, right? They tend to, however, use those more interpretivist and constructivist paradigms. There are also quite a large number of indigenous knowledge paradigms. So one thing that is important to note is that the ones I mentioned are very much rooted in westernized ways of seeing things. And these are the ones that people use most often. But that doesn't mean you have to. You can use a local paradigm that fits better with the context and be quite flexible. You can take, let's say, a constructivist view, but adapt it to a particular cultural context that suits it best. Because otherwise, how are you going to understand local context if you don't adapt it locally?
So we have another question. This is from Khalid Mahmood, who is from the University of Management and Technology. He's asking, can we have textual analysis as a research method when we have qualitative research, interpretivism with CDA and data coming from policy document and political debates?
Yes, definitely. You can use interpretivism. You can also use critical interpretivism, which may be a bit better suited for the particular study you're talking about, because critical interpretivism focuses on the influence of power in people interpreting things. And in your case, with the political debates and the documents and things, that'll probably suit best. And the textual analysis, because you are looking at the way the words are being used and how people interpret that, it fits quite well in that paradigm.
Okay, Dr. Neelam Amreen from RIU asks, in your experience, which research paradigm is most commonly used in AI and computer science research and why?
That's a great question. It depends on the type of study they're trying to do. If they are trying to, like, let's say they want to figure out how to develop a large language model so that it's, smarter or something like that, a very computer sciencey sort of focus, it is usually more positivistic or pragmatist work. If they are looking at, let's say, how AI is influencing learning in the classroom, they are usually much more constructivist or interpretivist, because it's a little bit on what it is you're trying to figure out, right? Is it to code the better AI? Is it how the AI can be used by people? Because that necessitates different types of paradigms.
We have a question from Rana Rubab Durrani, who is a faculty member at Forman Christian College in the Department of Center for Learning and Development, Center for Language Development. She is asking, do you think the positive paradigm can be applied to the use of AI tools as scaffolding for remedial English language learners?
It could, if you are trying to, for example, let's say you're doing, you're assessing how correct their English grammar is and how the error rates and things like that, and then the feedback they get from the AI and how that then decreases, hopefully, the error rates, right? So that is a cause and effect thing that you're trying to prove. So in that case, a post-positivistic approach would work.
We have a question from another faculty member from Forman Christian College, Dr. Samreen Ahmed. She asks, many management studies automatically adopt a positivist stance because archival or survey data is readily available. So how can researchers avoid selecting a paradigm based merely on methodological convenience and instead ensure alignment between ontology, epistemology, and the research question?
I like that question, because you're right, and it's not just management researchers that do that. It's a strategic choice because it's easy if you've got nice data sets that you can just, from a survey, that you can just analyze and give some quantitative answers, right? But I'm of the opinion that you shouldn't do research just because it's easy. You should do research to answer the questions that you're really interested in, right? So if you're really interested in a question that necessitates positivist things, go right ahead. But if you are really interested in the meaning making that your management studies people are doing, then really you should be brave in going against the grain of what everyone else in management is doing and adopting the stance that would actually help you to understand your research the best way possible. I can give you an example of that. The paragraph I showed you with the ChatGPT and the participant co-constructing knowledge. When we initially did that study, we used a fairly post-positivistic sort of way of looking at it to basically see, can it do qualitative analysis, right? Answers basically yes or no. But then through the process, we discovered that's actually really not how generative AI works. And actually the AI influences our understandings of things, and then we ask it things, and then we all work together. And so instead, it necessitates that constructivist understanding. So we changed the entire theory and everything in that study from what we initially wanted because of that understanding. It's the thing that works best to answer the question that you're actually really interested in, and that represents the way that you understand the world and the phenomenon that you're investigating.
Dr. Umar Shudat is asking, with respect to architecture and design domain, where there's an intersection between space and human beings, which paradigm should be considered?
I mean, I'm not an architect, so I will highlight that first. But if I was to guess, critical realism and pragmatism would suit best. And I think critical realism could be quite interesting because it's the the core reality of the physical building that is there, but also the experienced reality of the people experiencing how the building works, and it's different for different people. So you can sort of lean on both. So if I was to advise you where to start, I'd say that, but I mean, I am not an architect.
We have a student here, Saima Erzine, who is from the Department of Psychology. She is interested in knowing how she can use constructivism and interpretive paradigm, because mostly she's of the opinion that psychology students use positive paradigm.
Yes, psychologists do tend to go with post-positivism because they are quite focused on trying to be like the hard scientists and proving the scientific merit. And so they try and follow the scientific method quite precisely. But that doesn't mean you have to do that. Like people's psychological understandings of things are obviously very different. And so there is no reason why you can't apply constructivism or interpretivism if you're trying to understand let's say someone's lived experience of a mental illness. Interpretivist or constructivist approach would be much more appropriate because then you can focus in on that individual experience rather than focusing on the, let's say, the DSM categorizations or the, when they do a specific scale, the answers that they give.
So we have Anjum Asmat who is asking, if we used mixed method design and pragmatism, but we incorporate quasi-experimental design as an intervention, would it be a pragmatism research design?
It is, yes. So pragmatism can use whichever ones work best to answer a question, and a quasi-experimental approach is one way that could address a particular part of a project, like the quantitative part, for example, and then you lean that on to the qualitative part of your mixed methods, and together pragmatism suits that quite well.
So we also are streaming this on YouTube as well, where we have around 200 participants. And one of the participants from there, Javeria Khan, is asking, can we use interpretivist phenomenological analysis and thematic analysis in the same research side by side? If yes, how can that be done?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. People will have different opinions on that. If you're using interpretive phenomenological analysis, they have a very specific way of presenting the codes and how the codes are interpreted. If you're going to do thematic analysis, I mean, there's different types of thematic analysis, but in general, thematic analysis presents findings by theme rather than by the coding. And so there is a little bit of a tension as to how you would combine those together. If it's a really big study and you're trying to analyze them through both and then see, what different insights you get through the different analysis methods, you could probably do that. But if you were doing let's say a paper, I would probably focus on just one.
So we have another question from our YouTube audience from Kausar Khan, who's asking, if you are doing qualitative analysis, qualitative research and using grounded theory in sociology and gathering real life data or experiences of individuals, what kind of paradigm would that fall into?
I mean, you can do that. No, you can probably use many of the paradigms. The purpose of the grounded theory is to come up with a theory at the end, right? You can do that through a positivist lens, through a constructivist or interpretivist lens, based on people's individual experiences to lead to the theory that you develop. For example, I've done that before with constructivism. With the positivist one would be to get lots and lots of data through surveys to get to a core theory. I suppose you could use critical realism if your theory is focusing on trying to understand those generative mechanisms underneath. And so you want to develop a theory that develops that. Pragmatism, I think, would be a little bit not as good for grounded theory. You could still do it, but I think it'd not be as closely aligned as it could be.
So we have another question on our YouTube. It's by Nadia Batul, who's asking, given her study on SNAP versus OMP, what ontological assumptions is she making about clinical reasoning? Is it a measurable reality or a socially constructed process? And she did, I think, quasi-explanation for that.
If you are using quasi-experimental study, you are assuming core reality or truth out there, because that's the purpose of a quasi-experimental study. More generally, though, the topic could be going either direction. It depends on how you've asked your questions and how you've designed your study. But if you're saying you are using a quasi-experimental design to understand those things, you are approaching it through the scientific method, in essence, which is a very post-positivistic way of seeing things.
So another question is from Pervez Manginjo, who's asking you to give an example of a research topic and identify its ontological, epistemological, and axiological methodology.
That's interesting, because a topic can have many, because remember what I said before, it's always about the researcher. But I will give you an example. So my research area is doctoral education. I'm very into how to make doctoral education better, right? So what I value is learning experiences that are experiential in nature, that helps them develop their own academic identity, that sees doctoral students as researchers, not as students, so they are part of the process. So for me, axiology that's what's shaping my research. I'm really interested in understanding how they develop their academic identity as scholars, so how they come to see themselves as academics, right? That is something that necessitates a qualitative approach, because you can't examine someone's understandings of themselves otherwise. In my particular case, I am quite interested in working with people to develop an understanding. So that comes from that social co-construction component. That is why I use constructivism in my studies. So I see that the different academic identities that they develop is a construction in their minds, right? It's not actually like there isn't a one correct way to become an academic, right? There isn't that core reality or truth. Different people develop academic identity in different ways. So I need a qualitative approach that values subjectivity and that is able to understand meaning. And because I value the students being co-researchers with me, I value that social co-construction. So that leans towards constructivism.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lynette Pretorius. This was a very, very insightful session. I would just like to summarize some of the things that we have discussed so far. So the presentation has served as an essential guide for demystifying research paradigms by challenging the learners to critically examine their own perspectives on reality. The session has also distinguished between a realist ontology and where reality is seen as an objective entity, and a relativist ontology where it is viewed as a subjective construct shaped by individual experiences. We hope that by encouraging the researchers to consciously define these foundational concepts, the material will empower the researchers to better articulate their own research frameworks and understand how their personal epistemology and ontological beliefs fundamentally shape the path of their inquiry. I would like to quote Dr. Pretorius here. She said that, there's one correct way to become an academic. She just said that. And I think that would have resonated with, there's not one correct way to become an academic. And I think that would resonate for a lot of you as you, figure out your own individual expertise in research and academia. Thank you so much for a very, very superb session, Dr. Pretorius. And I would like to thank all the participants for joining in and for asking such valuable questions, which I believe everybody has learned from. We had 100 people here on the Zoom and about 200 on the YouTube. So it has been a great number also. I would also like to thank Ms. Fatma and Mr. Zarek from the CLT staff and the IT support that we have received for this particular session. We look forward to a lot of you joining in the future sessions also. I believe the registrations are still open for a few sessions, so if you have not already registered, you should join in. I would like to wrap up this session now. Thank you so much, everybody, and looking forward to your participation in the next session tomorrow. Thank you. Good evening, Dr. Lynette. I believe it's the end of the day, you'll also be excited to just rest now.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Most grateful.